Okay, good morning, Arroyo World. It is Friday, December the 19th. We've had a night to digest the gigantic day we had yesterday with rescheduling and have had time to sleep on it and build a lot more thought around what is coming as the news already from big players intending their entrance into the market. We can kind of start seeing how this is going to shape out. So again, I got Greg Dunaway with me here, my partner in crime with Maple Creek Consulting. My right hand person here. We can kind of talk about the market and what we're seeing both here domestically, and we both spent a lot of time on the international markets and what happens in those medical markets and how it might play back. So, Greg, let's first and foremost let's talk about some corporate moves that are happening into the market.
Yeah, I mean, it's no secret to the big boys what happened, right? It felt like they knew about it all along. I think at MJ, you and I heard whispers of this, but we'd heard whispers a lot. You and I have been kicked in the teeth enough in this industry to you hear a whisper, you go, "That sounds good. Let me know when they're yelling." But we did hear whispers of this. One of the big tip-offs that you and I talked about was at MJ BizCon. We heard rumors of banks that were going to look seriously at infusing capital in this market, which had never happened before. And now we see that clearly people knew in advance this was going to happen. Tilray came out on the day yesterday announcing that they're expanding and standing up a U.S. medical pharma program for cannabis. So that doesn't happen overnight. So this, I think what we learned was this was kind of in the works. People were aware of it, and we look at these international operators, Brad. You and I have been to Germany. We've seen the enthusiasm. One of the key elements that people should know is in the international market, they're not making a whole hell of a lot of weed. They're importing it, right? And the Europeans have very strict standards for that kind of cannabis. So you can kind of see here, people are looking at the US and going, okay, well, what does Mexico do? What do all these other countries do? And the answer in history is the USA is always the leader. Once we put up a framework, other people will kind of follow our lead. And you can see that the big boys are making these moves to get ready. They're ready to move into GMP full compliance. And if they're going to go to Germany, where you and I have been, where, I mean, hell, man, at that Mary Jane show, you want to talk about enthusiasm for cannabis. These guys know that having the whole USA cannabis imported into Germany, it's whoever the hell it is, it's Cookies, it's Jungle Boys. There's excitement there. And these guys are not going to miss the boat, and they're going to be ready.
Yeah, I mean, I think the common theme we were there the last time I wrote, anything came up is like Cali weed, Cali weed, Cali weed, right? And so that sets the bar for the rest of the world is the genetics that we've developed in these very established markets that are able to now. That's the other thing we didn't really touch on in our last conversation, but like, and it really didn't play into this, but like when this thing finishes up, does that mean that we can export? And like that right there is the biggest news that there is because we have all this product in the United States that we are overproducing. And we see that in operators' margins, wholesale price compression. It's been great for the consumers, kind of, sort of, for getting their prices down. Had really helped with quality. But if we now have a legitimate market to send all of this excess capacity into, and at the quality that we grow at, and the unique genetics that we grow, and are able to address the European market and the other emerging medical and recreational markets, I mean, that changes the entire game for everybody, not even accounting for what happens here in the US. So I think with that, right, we'll go with the big but, is that we also know from the operators that we have both talked to that feed the European market that the level of scrutiny that they have to go through to be able to sell into that market, and let's say, and they are selling into that medical market and they're selling flower and flower byproducts into the market, like those are GMP ready facilities. They are pharmaceutical grade facilities that have invested a tremendous amount of capital into not only their building, but the process and the systems that have to go into place to make compliance in those environments. And that's the thing that the reality for the average US operator they may want to look at that market, but they're going to have to figure out like what's it going to take to get into that market. And then again, man, we talked about this yesterday. I think that the other big thing that we don't know is what are the unintended consequences of what we just did. And I mean, I can think up a million around like, well, does the international distribution happen through like direct from producer to Europe, or they could be consolidators, and like what happens with that? And I'm like, it all of a sudden gets really opaque again of like what's the traditional outcomes be. But all in all, I mean, it rolls back to that companies gonna have to have really strong process. They're gonna have to be able to document this clearly. They're gonna have to document their results of how they got there and have from seed all the way to consumer a clear path of documentation of what they did to the plants through consumption to the consumer to be able to feed all these regulators. Because we talked about this yesterday as well, is like the one thing that we know that we are really good at is rulemaking. And the one thing that we do with rulemaking in the United States is we have like, you have to comply with the rulemaking and prove that you are complying with the rulemaking, which creates a tremendous amount of paper that has to go along with that. And it's going to be fun to watch everybody try to comply with it. So Tilray doing what they just did, dropping like Tilray Medical US, and recognizes that they have the corporate discipline and they have the systems and structures in place. And I would be willing to bet that they probably have lobbied really hard on this. And some of the ways that they have addressed the market in Canada is going to be the same way that we addressed the market in the US. So it'll be good to watch. All in all, I roll it back to, you're going to have good data. You're going to have clean acquisition. You're going to have to clearly show the whole chain of what you've done with the plants to be able to deliver to a consumer in a medical format.
Yeah, and I think it really what it does is, you and I both have read the EO now a number of times, which I would encourage everyone to do. One of the things that popped out to me was they made a deliberate note in the EO talking about formulations when they were saying, your THC to CBD formulas. I mean, they don't do this stuff by accident. So if you're out there saying, hey, I want to participate in the upside of this, whether that's interstate, whether that's international, and you don't have the ability to prove that when I'm growing, a White Widow or a Runts or any of the other ones that, are staples here that people over there might really want, you have to be able to prove that that is the same strain over and over again. Slight variations are happen what we're growing a crop, but you're not going to be able to do things like say, I say this is this without proving it. And I think the other really interesting thing was, if you're going to participate in the upcoming big pharma investment, and we should really talk about this, is there's no world that pharma is not getting involved here. And if you want to source pharma, which I think could be very lucrative, good fucking luck, pardon my French, telling a pharma guy, take my word for it, this is the same exact formulation. Because I'll tell you what, I talked to a pharma exec yesterday, and they've had problems with very quietly exploring CBD or very quietly exploring THC because they can't get consistency, and they need consistency in order to do medicine. So I think one of the key things that you're bringing up with data, traceability, and SOPs is we say it on this podcast, but to implement it the way that the FDA is going to require will require substantial capital. And that was one of the things I've really been worried about that you and I have been talking about is who can really participate in this? Is it the average grower in the state system? At this point, I would say absolutely not. If you are just an average grower who's had success in this system and you're kind of been flying by night, I don't know that any of this really applies to you. We talked yesterday about the kiddie table and the big boy table. I think Bo Whitney, one of the smartest guys in our space yesterday, was even vocalizing, we don't actually know if the 280E will apply to the state regulated cannabis businesses because they are operating kind of on an island over here. And the way that executive order was written, it certainly deliberately did not address the states. And depending on the administration or how you interpret it or whatever, you could say, oh, it's fine, I think it'll trickle down. Or if you're like Bo Whitney, you're a data guy, you're going, I don't know, guys. Like the fact is that they've set up a framework that has upside for those people who could comply. That's, I think, one of the key takeaways is having sat on it for a day. I'm a little more concerned than I was yesterday about the so-called benefits for everybody. I don't know that the EO really spells out how at all it impact an average grower in, say, California who doesn't want to play in the interstate or international space. I don't know that they're getting the benefits, and I'm curious if that's how you read it too.
Yeah, I did, and I read Frank Colombo's newsletter this morning, and he alluded to that as well. The other thing that was interesting is that when we look at that overall, like, what's the regulatory impact that's unintended, and again I keep going back to unintended consequences. Like, it's really the next bit of rulemaking is going to be the telling thing. I think everybody is waiting on every word that's going to come out of the agencies. The bigger thing that I look at now, Greg, is like the pragmatic. What about the right now? And the right now is that, according to the way that the EO was written, means that it gave the attorney general fast track ability by him referencing the USC code that he did in the EO to just push it. So we've already had public record. We've already had response. This kangaroo court that we stood up, right, that happened, that was a total sham. Everybody knew it. That basically was the firewall to prevent this was happening. My belief is that all of that language around that was to be able to bypass that, and the regulatory framework around the CSA and this particular action are very clear on what the AG can do. I'm hoping that that was the way he wrote it, and not he wrote it, right? The staffers wrote it, and the people who lobbied for this wrote it. That it's going to do that. But I'm like, yesterday was a monumental moment. We put some ink on paper for the first time in 50 years that reversed a very bad policy, and like celebrate that, like, hugely. And I'm sure there were a lot of boardrooms last night and a lot of corporate parties that were like, we rescheduled, we got it done. Right. I'm sure the guys at Normal are like, just like, had a rave. But like, that's so much of a small part of what's going to happen. And so I'm really paying very close attention to the news coming out of the agencies. And now it's all about due process. And so, like, what is the process that we're going to go through to push this? Is this ink on paper and we don't see anything for 2 years? Or is this ink on paper and we see something in 120 days? I don't know. And I think we're going to get early signs on that of which way it's going to go. But as much money and the people that were behind this that happened, I tend to believe it's going to be fast track. But I operate on what I know, and what I know is that even the head of the DEA is not bullish on this. So, like, I go back to we go back to way back. Like, is there a deep state conspiracy that's going to keep this from happening? Like, or is this indeed going to get pushed through, and the administration really wants it to happen? I mean, he made a big deal about it. Trump really wants to see this happen. Kessler was right beside him. He's a huge advocate with the Commonwealth Project. So I tend to believe it's going to be there. What I know is that, like I said yesterday, who knows? Like, with this administration and our current legislative environment and the regulatory environment, who knows? I'm hopeful, but I'm very, very skeptical as well.
I think there were some clues, and I think the clues that we can look for are our friend Mr. Kessler. He's heavily invested in CBD. The only timeline that was given, interestingly, had nothing to do with THC. They put a firm timeline in the press conference of saying, and Dr. Oz was up there, and he said, look, in Q2, if you are a certified CBD provider, our aim is to get you enrolled as a provider for Medicare and Medicaid for seniors. So out of everything that happened, that was the only timeline. Now, I think what we can divine from that is that, number one, Mr. Kessler has some serious juice. Number two, what we can divine from that is that there is a certain amount of speed that needs to happen, at least on the CBD side, interacting with Medicare and Medicaid. And those are beasts of a regulatory environment. So I think I do believe that they would not have done that if it weren't already somewhat in motion for getting CBD into the hands of seniors. If you watch the press conference, this was all about seniors, seniors, veterans, veterans, right? So I think, I want to circle back to something you said earlier. If you are a grower and you have if you have the capital to invest right now, what should you be doing? I would be calling everybody that involved who understands GMP, particularly EU GMP, because if you have a pathway to get there, why not? If you have a pathway to get there and you think that you can sit at the big boy table, and I'm going to keep using that analogy until I get proven otherwise here, Brad. I still think that there's two tables. If you want to get up from the kiddie table and go to the big boy table, go do it. If you have the capital there and you have the investment, or you're able to talk to some of these new banks that are getting into it, get that data, get those SOPs, become compliant, because when it does open up, whether that's Q2, Q3, you're going to be in good place. And if you're in CBD, I mean, I'll put my biases on the table here. I have a lot of issue with a lot of the CBD on the market that I don't think is particularly high grade. But if you are one of the rare ones who's growing and sourcing CBD at a pharmaceutical grade level, you should have been talking to someone in pharma yesterday. And you need to be talking to your suppliers and your growers to ensure that you do meet the standards necessary to participate. Because guess what, Brad? Once you enter Medicaid and Medicare, that's all 50 states. You don't have to do shit. And if you get doctors on board with your particular product, President Trump has given you the avenue and the complete green light.
Right. Greg, as we talk through this and we roll back to kind of the smaller individual operators, I mean, I think it's well established. You're an operator yourself. You've got Cole Cannabis in Arizona, pretty successful adult use brand. So as an operator, tell me like how you're thinking about this. All of a sudden now, if it all goes through, you have access to a market with a very large senior population, with a very large seasonal senior population. And so that might not necessarily walk into a dispo and go buy a pre-roll, right? Or go buy some gummies. But if they can have it medically delivered to their house and it's prescribed by a doctor, like, does that interest you as a cultivator and as an operator to be able to access that market? And I mean, what about you? What are you thinking? Like, should we at least start exploring this?
So this is a phenomenal question. And I'm going to take off my Maple Creek hat. I'm going to put that Colt hat on and just tell you the reality here in Arizona. So the reality here in Arizona is that this market sucks. The price per pound is low. The long and short of it is, this is an incredible opportunity for operators who have the ability to get the capital necessary to upgrade. I think from an independent, and also just because I think it's a very good idea to always operate from what's the worst case scenario. And I think we should articulate it. For independent, I want to be very clear. If you're an independent operator like I am, what's the worst case scenario? The FDA comes in and says, hey, this is Tylenol with codeine. This is ketamine. You asked us to reschedule. Guess what, motherfuckers? We're rescheduling and we mean it. Do I think that's going to happen? No, but let's talk through that. If that's the case and they come in and say you're Tylenol with codeine, everything changes. How that framework is you must be FDA registered as a cultivator. The dispos must be FDA registered to dispense these drugs that they view as very serious drugs, anabolic steroids, ketamine, Tylenol with codeine. That is how the framework has been, Brad. If there is not a carve out and you are an independent operator, you will have no choice but to comply with everything that you need. SOPs, data, repeatability. You must prove it to the FDA or they will not let you sell. So when I look at it from an independent operator and I'm removing my Maple Creek hat, I'm scared. I think everyone should be a little bit scared. Even if there's a 10% chance that the FDA says, you asked for it, you got it. That is very terrifying because you must comply. And the investment necessary is in probably the hundreds of thousands of dollars to get where you need to be. Now, again, let's be positive. If you were to do that, the upside is very strong. You can export over state lines. You can get into Germany. But independent operators, we don't have the juice. We don't have the capital that a lot of the big boys have. And guess what? You know who wasn't in that room with President Trump? Kim Rivers was there the whole time until that ceremony. You've got Mr. Kessler. You've got a lot of people who are operating at a national and international scale. This EO was written for them. There wasn't cult cannabis. There weren't alien labs. There weren't jungle boys in that room. I can tell you that. So when I look at it from purely the cult standpoint, I'm very nervous. I don't know, and my suspicion is this is not good for independent operators. And I'll give you one last example and get your feedback on it. This gives the ability of Trulieve to completely single source where they grow, wherever that is, their lowest cost of growing, make it up to the FDA standards, and move it over state lines as easily as they can. And it's going to be mid-grade, throw it into a Mylar bag cannabis, but they can go wherever they want. That for independent operators is nowhere in our future unless there is a substantial amount of additional regulation that, frankly, with the tone and the tenor of this press conference and EO, I do not see that happening.
Well, I take off my cannabis hat and I just put on my business hat here, and I'll pretend to be a very well established Harvard MBA here, right? I play one on television. So when we look at that, I just look at it in general, and it doesn't take an MBA from Harvard to figure this out. Is that if interstate commerce comes with this, and it's like we're manufacturing cannabis as medicine, as Schedule III medicine, are you going to manufacture in the most expensive places in the country? Or are you going to manufacture where power cheap, sun plentiful, and there's a lot of water, right? And that like the Sun Belt is where this is going to happen. So the operators in the northern part of the country that are going to want to participate, unless they've got cheap power to supplement for the sunlight that we get for free, like the operating costs are going to stay high. And so as a large operator, as thinking like Kim would be thinking, I would be putting my capital back into Florida. What a great state to grow in. You got plenty of sunshine. You got beautiful weather. Power's pretty cheap, right? Across the entire Southeast, power's pretty cheap. Like, yep. And the other thing, like unintended consequences. Think about the competitive thing that we're going to have with power now. We know how much power. You write the checks for your power bill. It ain't cheap, right? But all of a sudden, so now we got this burgeoning industry with cannabis coming out that is power hungry, right? Like these big greenhouses, we turn up 3, 4, 5, 10,000 lights, 1,000 watts of light. That's a lot of power. Guess who we're competing with? We're competing with AI now, right? For cost. Single largest consumer of electricity in the United States. I got another tap on a very fragile power grid. So this, again, unintended consequences. So it's going to be really interesting to watch. I think you will watch and see non-local operators consolidate their operations into the least cost areas, which, the net benefit to that, Greg, is that in underserved rural markets, we now have an agricultural crop that can provide wealth and a better way of life for those farmers that can access that market and really up-level the production value of their land. And if they can do it, so if they can build it, comply and all that, and I think it's going to end up being probably a cross between, what the large MSOs are doing now, and they were forced to do because they had to operate in each state. Imagine if you talk to any CEO of any MSO and they said, if you could grow in one place, if you didn't have to have 20 cultivations, would you? The answer would be no, right? I'd want to centralize. I'd have 7 million square feet and somewhere pretty cheap, and that I could draw talent, because it does take people to do this. But I think that's gonna consolidate as well. So all this being said is that, rolling it all back, when I think about Arroyo and what we do and how we help cultivators, is we provide a tremendous amount of data to make things consistent, right, in the product and drive quality. And we've seen that. We've talked to multiple customers in multiple markets, and the theme is consistency and quality. And when we roll into a federally regulated medicinal market, that becomes like times 1,000, because it's going to be whoever's buying it on these 60-day cycles, or if you're you're doing some fancy things like our friends at Faven are doing, or getting down into 49-day cycles. So anywhere from every 50 to 60 days, you got something coming out that's a biological product, and it's got to be identical. It's going to have to fit in a very narrow margin of specifics, of what's the word I'm looking for, of specifications. There we go. Man, it's lost me. Of specifications of what it's going to need, of what they want. And it could be, we want this much THC, we want this much CBD, we want this much CBN, we want this much CBG. Like, last night I had a stigma sleepy, right? It was 10 milligrams plus CBG. Slept like a baby last night. But that is what's going to happen in the pharmaceutical market. We're going to take these compounds and go from there. The last piece that, and we run a little over here, but that's okay. This is important, that I think becomes really, really important as we roll through this, is the other thing we haven't talked about, and not a lot of people have been talking about yet, is all of a sudden now do we get intellectual property protections on the genetics? Like, so these guys that are growing great genetics, and they're like, and somebody's getting a cut, and they are copying their genetics and not paying royalties on that, because that's like just the cost of doing business, and that goes away, right? And I look at this, and all of a sudden it's like, okay, I am the guy that invented lemon cherry gelato, and I'm going to patent it.
So I think you brought up something really interesting here. I want to circle back to one thing you said, and I'm going to get to that, which is one of the smart guys that you and I both know is Frank Colombo. And when we chatted with him, I think he also knew something was coming, because he told me, you know what this is a lot like? And I was blown away by his answer. He said, this is going to go exactly like the way of airlines. He said, airlines, when they first started, every Tom, Jerry, and Nick had an airline to get you from here to there. And all of a sudden, it doesn't make a lick of sense. You get consolidated, you're regional, and eventually you're national. I think, to circle back to your point, when I was talking to the pharma executive, look, if they're developing a medicine and it comes from cannabis, who do you think is going to be the big boy in the room that's going to own that formulation? And you'll note that I said formulation, not strain. They don't give a shit about the strain. They give a shit about, the percentages of the terpenes and however it is that they're making this medicine. So I think everyone has to be very careful here, because I think the upside is if you can get a relationship with pharma that's moving into this, you're in a great position. Do I think that all of a sudden the federal government's going to let you submit lemon cherry gelato as a patent? No, I don't. I don't think that we have the framework for it, and I don't think it's going to happen. However, I do think that there's a lot of upside, whether it's a German pharmaceutical, a U.S. pharmaceutical. Anyone who's getting involved will look to you for what you said, Brad, that consistency, because they're making medicine. I know we're over time, but I am really curious. One thing that really made me laugh yesterday was the Canadians beat us to the punch. They've been exporting for a long time. They know what they're doing up there. I am very curious about what happens to the appetite for cannabis that has been coming into Germany and other places that's from Canada, when all of a sudden you can get Humboldt certified medicine on a plane over, or a boat over, because I think you and I both know, the best cannabis you're always going to get is a locally grown great cannabis. But if your opportunity is, I can get free cannabis because I live in Berlin and I go to my doctor and he prescribes it for me and my healthcare covers it, maybe that's not such a concern. And the other question is, if you have a choice between your medicine and your doctor says, hey, do you want this grown in Montreal or do you want this grown in California? My strong suspicion, having been on the international route for a long time, is that that's going to dramatically impact the bottom line of Canadian operators. I think that's another subject that's probably worth its own conversation, but it struck me when we were talking about kind of how these facilities have already been up and running and have the data that do it well. Let's give Canada credit. They've done it well. Now, the big concern I would have is that if I'm a Canadian operator is all of a sudden you've got Jungle Boys making a deal with Glasshouse, which, by the way, I just pulled that out of my ass. But I was saying Glasshouse is what, another 3 million feet they haven't activated because they were waiting for this moment. Oh boy,
I bet you Graham's ordering some Rockwell right now.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that is truly when you want to think about the things that we know. Here's what we know: the bigger operators are going to win. The bigger operators are well positioned. The bigger operators arguably wrote this EO. People like me, putting my Colt hat back on, I'm very, very scared, and I think a lot of people should be. Unless you are willing to make that investment and make that strategic decision to get your butt up to the big boy table, and even then, I don't know that the big boys have empty seats.
Right. I agree. I'm going to go back to one thing you said. I'm going to put a little bit of tension in this conversation. I wholeheartedly disagree with you on the intellectual property discussion. So being around, and like my entire career being around intellectual property and following agricultural intellectual property for the last few years, is that I do believe that is going to be the next rush of, we are going to find high quality genetics and people are going to patent it. And now that we have the ability, and like we will have support from the federal government, here is the genome that makes up what I did. This is the unique thing that we added to it. Did I make it fusarium resistant? Did I do like whatever? That is going to happen, right? I'm like, I can't think it's happened across every other agricultural product in the world. We can't help think it's going to happen with cannabis. What that does is now that creates, one, I'm glad, because people spend a lot of time developing these genetics that get ripped off, right? And then there's a lot of things where people are selling genetics and they're saying, hey, this is sour diesel and it's like something else, right? So the other thing that I'm wondering, and I want to part on, is that I think we all need to think about, as this goes through and all these new unintended consequences that happen as a result of this happening, is that these intellectual property protections that are going to go in, there are going to be some very large companies that start doing this. And I'm going to call it the biggest one in agriculture, which is either going to be Pioneer or Monsanto, of finding a way to inject their intellectual property and to protect it. And we've seen how fiercely that they protect what they have developed, right? From like where people may have gotten cross-pollinated in a field, from protected crops to non-protected crops, and the people with the non-protected crops show up with having their genetics, and they either get sued or they got to start paying royalties on something they didn't intend to grow. So that is I think like that is something we're going to watch over time. And is that a tomorrow problem? Is that a next week problem? 4 or 5 years from now, I think that's going to be one of the things that we talk about, is like, who were the smart people that started figuring out like what parts of the plant can we protect that is highly desirable for the entire market, and how does that get monetized? That's I can't help it. I mean, there's too many people that have highly protected seed products that are in the rest of agronomy. It's going to happen. It's going to be, but the enforcement on it and all that's going to be fun, because we have the whole cannabis culture that flies into it as well. Greg, thanks so much. It's been another great session. I can't believe we're gone another 30 minutes on this. I think we could probably go another 3 hours. I don't know if anybody want to hear us drone on that long. Thanks again for the time today, man. It's always good for you. For all of our listeners out there, I hope you guys have a great holiday week. A lot more coming next week with the news. So do me a favor, click like and subscribe to our little show here. We'll have a lot more on cannabis regulation, the impact, and how that's going to impact customers next week. Thanks so much.
Thanks, guys.